Hey folks, it is my utmost honor to bring our next speaker to the stage. She wants me to be particularly sure, and I like to forget things, so I'll start off and say she's originally from Harlem, so rock on. I look forward to hearing more about that. She's got an amazing story that starts there and is led all over the world, particularly involving amazing work with the EPA and a number of environmental organizations. As someone who just finished an environmental degree, I hope to have half of the credentials that this next lady, Miss Vernice MillerTravis, has at this point later in my career. So please welcome to the stage Vernice MillerTravis. Thank you so much.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Thank you, Brad, you patient, sweet soul. I was the hardest person to track down for the last 6 months that he's been tracking me. And finally he said, why don't I send her a text? And lo and behold, we had this huge dialogue on text, and that's how I got here, because I just am not in the same place a lot. I bring you greetings from my company, Skio Solutions, or Skio. We used to be known as E Squared. We're based in Charlottesville, Virginia. How many people here from Charlottesville? All right, Charlottesville in the house. We have about a third of our staff is based in Charlottesville. We're an environmental planning and design firm. I particularly do a lot of work in the arena of environmental conflict resolution and mediation. Sometimes in some very difficult circumstances where local government, industry, and communities are at war with each other over a legacy of environmental contamination and/or new plans to build new facilities or plans to try and clean up in contaminated land and reuse it. That's my particular specialty, the adaptive reuse of contaminated property and contaminated land, and how to get people to work from a consensus-based process together. When you add race and class to that dynamic, it's like pouring gasoline on a fire, right? People just can't seem to find their way to one another, even if they're saying the same things or they have the same objectives. They're just talking and usually screaming past each other, and my job is to stand in the middle. But I didn't always stand in the middle. Sometimes I was one of the people doing the screaming, right? So that's how I can be so good at telling other people how to work it out. Because I used to be one of those people who was doing the screaming. And why was I one of those people who was doing the screaming? So, as Brad said, I'm originally from New York City, from the Harlem Community in New York City. At one time, the Harlem Community had the largest concentration of people of African descent outside of the continent of Africa anywhere in the world. That is not true anymore. It's moved to Kings County, Brooklyn. That's a typically New York thing, right? If you're from one of the 5 counties in New York City, you don't particularly care for, and you may not have ever visited any of the other 4 counties in New York City. It's a totally parochial thing that's only common to New Yorkers. We can't explain it to other people. When you come to New York City and somebody from Manhattan says they don't go to the Bronx, and you're like, what? Whereas in Virginia, you travel hundreds of miles to get from one place to another, to move from one community to another. So anyway, I'm born and raised in the Harlem community, and after college, I went to work for this extraordinary place called the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice. Any UCC members in the room? So the wonderful thing about our lovely, tiny, tiny Protestant denomination is that we are the remnants of the Pilgrims, right? So if you want to know what the Pilgrims' faith was, talk to us, because we're the ones who are still living, trying to talk to folks about how to live together. So I went to work for this incredible organization, United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, the civil rights arm of the UCC, which at the time, the United Church of Christ was located in New York City, in Manhattan. And in college, I met this wonderful person named Ben Chavis. Ben had been a longtime minister and civil rights advocate, and he went to do some work in Wilmington, North Carolina, dispatched by the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice to really work to help lift up the African American community, and that in Wilmington, North Carolina, and in the course of his organizing and work, was accused by the state of North Carolina of fomenting a riot. and put in prison with 9 other people for 4 years until his conviction was overturned. And so in college, I worked on the National Defense Committee to get Ben and the other 8 people who were known as the Wilmington, 9 people who were known as the Wilmington 10 out of jail. And right after I graduated from college, I guess my senior year, I heard from a former classmate of mine who had gone to graduate school at UNC Chapel Hill that Ben Chavis was living in New York. And I said, no, not possible. She said, yeah, he's in New York. She said, not only is he in New York, he's across the street from our college. So we went to a college in New York called Barnard College. And Ben was at Union Theological Seminary finishing his PhD and in divinity. And I just couldn't believe it. So every day I would walk up and down the streets where I lived between my apartment and campus, which was about 5 blocks, scouring for Ben Chavis. I mean, every day, walking up and down the street looking for this man. And sure enough, one day I ran into him on the corner of the very block that I lived on. And he lived in the next street, in the same street that I lived on. And we talked for about an hour. And I invited him to campus, and I kept in touch with him. And I would call him up every 6 months after I graduated from college to say, you know, you need to hire me because I am the greatest thing since sliced bread. I'm telling you, you have not met another young person as dynamic as I am who brings as much as I bring to the table. Chutzpah. That's one of the things you get from being from Harlem. Chutzpah. You got that in great excess. And so one day, after 3 years of calling him every day for every 6 months, telling him he needed to hire me, he said, well, you know, Vernice, you might be interested in this research project we're about to do. It's called a Special Project on Toxic Injustice. Now, I was a political science major. I had known since I was in the 9th grade that I wanted to be a civil rights attorney. That's what I thought I was put on this earth to do. And so Ben mentioned the phrase toxic injustice. I had no idea what the hell he was talking about. I didn't know what toxic and what injustice could possibly have to do with each other. In all of my studies and all of the things I had ever read and all of the professors I had ever studied with, no one ever put toxic and injustice in the same sentence. So I said, well, this is an opportunity. Let's go and see what Ben is talking about. So I went and I met their research director, a man named Charles Lee. Charles is Chinese American. Charles now is the Associate Assistant Administrator for Environmental Justice at the Environmental Protection Agency. This was 1986 when I went to meet Charles. And Charles described this special project on toxic injustice. And what the project was about was a response to many local churches within the UCC in North Carolina and South Carolina in particular that were calling the national church to say that their state, local, and local government, and sometimes private entities, were building hazardous waste facilities in their community without ever having spoken to the people who lived there or even having informed them of what was going to happen. One community in particular, in Warrenton, North Carolina, really stood up and rose up and said, we are not going to be the repository for the state's first hazardous waste landfill. And they decided to take the strategies of the civil rights movement of the 1960s and employ those strategies to fighting the construction of the first hazardous waste landfill in the state of North Carolina in their community. Now, I should say their community was 90% African American, 90% rural. Right across the Virginia border is this county, where this landfill was going to be. And they rose up and said, we are not going to accept it. But they called their national church, and they said, we need your help. So the church started to get all these calls from so many little churches all over the Deep South who were having the same experience. And so the UCC decided to do a research project funded by the donations that came in through Sunday collections. A portion of those Sunday collections, like every national church, goes to the national church. And so they took some of that money, and they said, we're going to do this research project, special project on toxic injustice, and it looked at 3 things. Is there a relationship between the location of hazardous waste sites, the residential zip code in which those sites are located, and the racial composition of the people who live in those residential zip codes? And it was my job to culminate all that data. If you were my friend or relative at that time, the last thing you wanted was a phone call from Vernice, because I was calling everybody Do you want to know how many hazardous waste sites there are in the zip code where you live? Everybody who knew me was getting those calls, and of course nobody wanted to know. But I thought it was important because I had no idea, and most people had no idea that these kinds of land uses were happening in their midst. And the reason they didn't know is because most of those land uses were happening next to where poor people, where tribal communities, and where communities of color lived. And if you did not happen to be in one of those groups, you had no idea where this hazardous waste was going. You had no idea where the polluting facilities were. You had no idea where the landfills were because they weren't where you lived, but they were where we lived. And it turns out that after looking at 60 different variables of how and where these decisions were being made, it turned out that race proved to be the most statistically significant indicator in where these facilities were located. Was I shocked? No. Was I demoralized? Absolutely. Because it's the kind of hypothesis that you sort of know is out there, but you hope that the data, when you begin to collect that data, is going to lead you to some different answer and some different outcome. So we published this report in 1987, Toxic Waste and Race in the United States. And this is the first report to look at the relationship between race and the environment ever published in the US. Did I know that when I was working on this study? Did I know that when I was badgering Ben, that the result was going to be this? Did I know that this research, this work, was going to change my life? I had no idea. But in the course of doing it, so one anecdote that I like to share with folks. So you see this map on the front? I can pass this one out, and I think I will. This is my baby, but I have another one that I don't pass out. But do make sure you give it back. This map is a map that shows where people of color live and how many hazardous waste sites are where they are. Where you see the empty areas is where there are hardly any people of color. But wherever people of color live in the United States, you will find hazardous waste and or polluting facilities and industries in close proximity to where they live. So when I did this map, I created this map, can I pass this to somebody here? The only entity that had access to geographic information systems, data, and analysis was the Department of Defense. It was not publicly available. So I had a huge map of the United States, county by county. It covered a 6-foot table, and I colored in, from the data that I took from US EPA, I colored in where those landfills were and those hazardous waste sites were, and then I had a graphic artist reproduce the map that I had made, coloring by hand. It took us 6 months to produce that. How long would it take you to pull that data together now? 60 seconds if you know what you're doing, 15 minutes if you're stumbling along, right? Just shows you how things have changed. That report gave credence and support and yeast to communities across the United States who had been raising these issues for time immemorial, but had been completely ignored and completely dismissed about the issues that they were raising. So it wasn't just that people lived in close proximity to these facilities. It was that because they lived in close proximity to these facilities, it was creating public health challenges, incidents of disease, premature death that was going unaddressed. So, for example, in my own community in New York, right when I was doing this research, I stumbled across a group of people who were building an independent Democratic club in New York. Now, that may not seem like a lot here, but in New York, oh Lord, that's a serious undertaking. To be independent, to really be about the Constitution, to really not be about party ideology, but about the people that you serve. So this group, West Harlem Independent Democrats, was working on these issues. I really didn't want to be a part of party politics, but I went to a meeting one evening, and bam, the only thing they were talking about was the North River Sewage Treatment Plant, and that the North River Sewage Treatment Plant was being built in the midst of the community that I lived in, the community that I grew up in. A sewage treatment plant that treats all the wastewater and raw sewage generated on the entire west side of Manhattan, from the southernmost end, south of Wall Street, to the northernmost end. 180 million gallons of raw sewage a day pumps through this facility, right on the edge of our community, across the street from where 100,000 people live, with no odor control devices. Can you imagine? 180 million gallons of raw sewage a day. And it hit me like a brick. So this might not be a hazardous waste site, but this is the same set of issues that I'm looking at in my own research. It's happening right here in my neighborhood. So we began to organize and mobilize and inform people. And when we would have public meetings, hundreds of people would come out at a time. And every person who went to the mic to speak would mention asthma. Asthma in their homes, asthma among their families, asthma among young people, asthma among older people, asthma among middle-aged folks. Every household had asthma. So we decided to do some research related to that with Columbia University School of Public Health, my alma mater. And what we found was that we had the highest incidence of asthma of any community in the Western Hemisphere. Not just in the United States of America, in the Western Hemisphere, which also includes what? Mexico City, and they got really bad air quality, right? But not only did we have the highest rate and incidence of asthma, we had the highest rate of premature death from asthma of any community in the United States, and that shook my world. And that's when I decided that this research that I was doing, that I would need to do more of that in a variety of places, but it would need to be connected to communities so that, one, they could be informed, two, they could develop and formulate strategies about what to do about it, how to reduce the environmental burden, how to increase public health, how to make sure that people had equal access and were being treated equally before the law. And that led to the life that I have had for the last 30 years. This has been my life's work. Now, I'm not a civil rights attorney, although my former colleagues at the Natural Resources Defense Council will tell you that I play one every day, because it's my job to understand environmental law and regulation, and to understand how it is being meted out and how it is not, and to make sure that people understand the most technical information in ways that they can access it, they can use it, they can understand it, and then they can empower themselves. So one of the great pieces of training that I do is to train people on how to be effective in giving public comment at public hearings, right? Don't just go to the mic and say, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. That's great the first 2 times. But the third time, people know you're sick and tired of being sick and tired. Tell people what is the problem and what you want them to do about it. If it's a regulatory hearing, tell the regulatory agency what they can do to better their process and to better make sure that people are being treated equally before the law. Now, why is that important? Because the Civil Rights Act of 1964 demands that if you are the recipient of federal dollars, any federal dollars, $1 federal dollar, you must make sure that the utilization of that money is not being spent in a way that discriminates against folks who are defined as protected groups in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, how many people think or have seen federal dollars come into their state, into their local government, but yet see housing development that goes on where poor people live in substandard housing? But they're getting federal money. That's a violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. Or seen a Department of Transportation in your state, or your locality, or your county receive federal transportation dollars, but yet either obliterate some communities because of road and transportation and highway construction, or cut off some communities, or burden some communities with all the transportation facilities, so the sanitation trucks, the buses, everything is going to go in certain communities and burden those communities. That's a violation of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. It's my job to explain that to people in a way that they can access it, a way they can understand it, and then help folks sit down at the table with regulators and have a dialogue and a conversation about how to resolve those problems. Some days that's really fun, some days is really ugly. But at the end of the day, if you get to a place where people really can talk to each other and can understand each other and can come together to work on resolving problems, then you have really had an impact. And that's the kind of thing that I try to do. So I had a couple of things, more than a couple of things, written down that I wanted to share because I thought it was important that people have a grounding of what this conversation is about. So how many people have heard the term environmental justice before? Oh, that's so good. Environmental racism. Environmental inequity. That's what I'm talking about. We're reaching mass saturation here. But I want to give you the definition that really resonates with my soul. EPA and federal agencies have another definition. It's a good definition. It hasn't been tweaked in 25 years. It needs some updating. But here's the definition that I use of environmental justice. It's written by Professor Bunyan Bryant. For 35 years, Professor Bryant directed the environmental advocacy program at the School of Natural Resources and the Environment at the University of Michigan. And this is what Bunyan wrote. Environmental justice refers to those cultural norms and values, rules, regulations, behaviors, policies, and decisions to support sustainable communities where people can interact with confidence that their environment is safe, nurturing, and productive. Environmental justice is served when people realize their highest potential without experiencing the isms, racism, sexism, ageism, gender discrimination. Environmental justice is supported by decent paying and safe jobs, quality schools and recreation, decent housing, adequate health care, personal empowerment, and communities free of violence, drugs, and poverty. These are communities where both cultural and biological diversity are respected and highly revered, and where distributive justice prevails. That's what environmental justice is, that people are treated equally before the law, that people have equal access to resources, whatever those resources are, that there's a respect for nature, and in places where there is a respect for nature, there is usually a respect for people. Not always, but those two things more often than not come together. That for more than 30 years, people have been raising these issues, that the environment is not meted out equally, and that some people live in a safe environment and some people do not. We're going to hear later today, I think at 2 o'clock, from one of my new heroes. And I hope you will all be here and bring someone to listen to him talk, Professor Mark Edwards from Virginia Tech, who stood up and fought valiantly for the people of Flint, Michigan. And if not for him, people would still not know that folks are being poisoned every day by the water that they're drinking, right? So just a shout out to Virginia Tech and to Professor Mark Edwards. He's going to be here at 2 o'clock. So there have been a lot of recent events around the country that have brought the environmental justice issues to the fore, right? Because oftentimes these issues are very subterranean. They matter to you if you live in a community where these issues are prevalent, but they don't seem to reach the level of national attention until you get something like a Flint. But let me mention a few other things that you may have heard about that have brought these issues to the fore. So of course there's Flint, Michigan. Did you know that there are 13 other cities in Michigan that have higher levels of lead in their water than does Flint, Michigan? Did you know that? Good, somebody said yes, I'm glad. There's also East Chicago, Indiana. Anybody heard the story about East Chicago, Indiana lately? This is the Calumet Public Housing Project, built on top of a lead smelter. The Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, a federal agency that does health risk assessments for communities that live near hazardous waste sites, multiple times issued studies saying that there were no adverse environmental health issues ongoing in this community. People were safe, and they did not need to be relocated. You might have read recently that the state of Indiana and the federal Department of Health and Human Services and HUD are relocating every single resident of this public housing project out of the Calumet houses because the whole thing is contaminated with lead from top to bottom and has been for decades. And I don't think that they just found out about this 30 days ago. Just saying. Or you may have heard about the Battle of the Standing Rock Sioux, right? Who are fighting to keep an oil pipeline from coming under their sacred land, but also under their sole source aquifer, the Oglala Sioux aquifer, which provides drinking water to thousands of people, not just Native Americans. That's an important point that I'll come back to in the 7 minutes that I have left. Al Dejon Charles, band of the Biloxi-Chitimacha-Choctaw. Anybody heard about them? Al Dejon Charles is a parish in Louisiana. It's an island that these Choctaw Indians live on. The whole entire Community, the whole entire band of these Choctaw are being relocated elsewhere in Louisiana. Why? Because their land is underwater. And they can no longer live where they've lived for centuries, for millennia, because of rising sea level. But you know, that climate change thing is still in doubt. And you know I'm going to end on that, right? Who else do we have? We have massive and devastating flooding in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and Charleston, West Virginia, right? We also had really, really bad flooding in eastern North Carolina 2 weeks ago, right? Not related to Hurricane Matthew. So people have been suffering and struggling. These are just the things that are going on this year, right? And it's only October. We still got 2 months to go. God only knows what else could happen. There's so many incidents like this that are happening around the country. And then the point is that we all need to pay attention. That even if you are safe in the place that you live, that may only be cosmetic. There may be issues with your drinking water. There may be issues with your air quality. There may be issues with the quality of the food and the food supply that you eat in terms of chemicals that are used in the production of that food. The chemicals that are used in the production of that food that we all care about, first and foremost, is a problem for the people who are growing the food, who are usually farm workers, who are usually immigrants. And they are being sprayed in the fields while they're working with those same pesticides that are being used to keep pestilence away from our food. These people are treated the same as the bugs that they are trying to keep away from our food supply. It's really important that we pay attention to that because as consumers, we have a lot to say about what happens in that space. So I want to raise with you, and I have raised with you, these concerns, but all is not dire, right? So it's like, boy, Vernice, you've given us this catalog of horribles, right? You know, where's the uplift here? Where's the inspiration? Here's the inspiration. In 1991, hundreds of people gathered in Washington, D.C. at the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. And we came from a community like mine in New York, from communities all over the United States. 700 people came. And the first thing that struck me about that gathering, which was sponsored by the United Church of Christ Commission for Racial Justice, was that I thought that the work that we were struggling with in Harlem and New York, that we were the only community that was so impacted. And when I walked into that ballroom in that hotel, and I saw those hundreds of other people, the first thing I felt was, we are not alone. You cannot imagine how isolating it is to be having these conversations, trying to have dialogue with your local government. In the case of ours in New York City, the mayor, at the time, Ed Koch, was quoted in the New York Times as saying, there's no odor problems at that plant. These are just a bunch of screaming memes who just want to start trouble, but there are no problems. And I'm like, 180 million gallons of raw sewage being pumped every day with no odor control devices. Surely somebody else must smell this than us, right? We are not the only people that are smelling raw sewage every day. Ultimately, we sued the city of New York, made them spend $55 million to fix it. They had to pay our community-based organization, West Harlem Environmental Action, $1.1 million. I think he got my point. Communities across the United States have been waging successful campaigns. And the core of their campaign is that you cannot achieve sustainability, which is such a watchword in our country today and across the globe. You cannot achieve sustainability without racial justice, economic justice, and social justice being pivotal elements of the construct of what sustainability is. You just can't get there. There is no line that goes to sustainability that doesn't traverse through those other core values and principles. We talked about that. We developed and produced the 17 Principles of Environmental Justice at the First National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. We talked about issues of fairness and equity, but we also talked about valuing every person wherever they live, whoever they are, whatever they look like, equally. And that if you really want to respect our earth, respect our planet, respect the environment, respect all living things, you can't respect animals and plants and designate some of them as endangered and do everything in your power to fight for them and not recognize that there are endangered people and endangered communities. And most of those people are poor and or immigrant and or people of color and or indigenous people. We must put as much energy and effort into protecting and defending their interest as we do for the endangered whales. So I had a colleague at NRDC, a beloved colleague, Joel Reynolds. And Joel was the person who fought for many, many decades the Department of the Navy about their sonar exercises in the Pacific Ocean off the coast of California that was severely impacting the great blue and gray whales in their migratory patterns from the Arctic down to Baja, Mexico. And I would say to Joel all the time, you know, Joel, I love you. I love you. But if I hear one more word about them damn whales, I'm going to kill you, okay? Just once could we fight for the people in South Central LA as hard as we're fighting for those whales. Now, Joel did win and beat the Navy half to death every time. He did win on behalf of those whales, and that's really, really, really important. But the last thing I want to say to you is that it's really important that we lift each other up, that we stand and defend each other. The air so pollution does not work that it's only confined in my neighborhood, right? That's how the air, the soil, and the water works. They move. So the last thing I want to say, because my time is up, is that my family, my dad is from the Bahamas. My family lives in the Bahamas. We have heard countless accounts of how Hurricane Matthew has ravaged Haiti, and we need to pray deeply for the people of Haiti. We haven't heard one word about what's happening in the Bahamas, not one word. And they took a direct hit from a Category 4 hurricane that hovered over those island nations. I have not been able to reach my family on the phone for 2 days. The point is, global warming is tearing it up for all of us, all of us. And we have to stand together, bring our best selves, our best research, our best science, our best advocacy on behalf of each and every one of us. That's justice, that's sustainability. Thank you so much.